everyone, and welcome to Macquarie University's Postgraduate Security, Intelligence and Criminology Showcase. I'm Bridget, a Macquarie Student Ambassador and your host for the evening. Before we start the session, I would like to acknowledge the First Nations peoples of Australia and elders past, present and emerging. I would like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander guests in the audience today. As we allow some more time for attendees to join us online, I'll just run through some quick housekeeping for this webinar. Please note that participant cameras and microphones have been muted to maximize the webinar experience. Please ask your questions throughout the session via the Q&A function on the bottom of your toolbar, and we'll endeavour to answer these at the end of the session. Stay tuned until the end for your exclusive attendee offer. Welcome to Macquarie University's Postgraduate Security, Intelligence and Criminology Showcase. I'm Bridget, a Macquarie University Student Ambassador, and in tonight's session, you'll hear from our course directors from each of our masters in this interesting and important area. They'll give you some insight into the Macquarie benefits, what you will learn, and you'll also have your chance to get your questions answered tonight. To kick off tonight's session, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Associate Professor Adam Lockyer. Adam is the course director for both the Master of Security and Strategic Studies and the Graduate Certificate of Security Studies and Criminology. For our audience, please put any questions you may have for Adam in the Q&A chat box. And Adam, it's over to you.
Thank you, Bridget. So it's my pleasure to speak to you tonight about the Master of Strategic and Security Studies. Now, the Master of Strategic and Security Studies primarily looks at issues such as war and peace, international stability, and the use of armed force. And so, excuse me. So over recent years, we've seen a lot of activity in this space. The Ukrainian war, when Russia invaded the Ukraine last year, has really put international war back in the spotlight. And in particular, we've been learning a lot about the enduring aspects of armed conflict, what aspects of the battlefield are reminiscent of what we've expected in the 20th century. But we're also learning a lot about the new aspects and new domains of conflict. So we're seeing the use of drones, for example, information warfare and cyber are these new dimensions, new layers of the conflict that we haven't seen before. And the moment that the conflict began, questions began to be asked about stability in our own region, whether or not the war in the Ukraine was going to make conflict in the Indo-Pacific more likely. The fact that NATO and the United States' attention was going to be focused on Europe, would that make it more likely that China might make a move on Taiwan, for example? And in Australia, we've seen a lot of activity in the defence and strategic space over the past few years. The headline item, of course, has been AUKUS. That is the joint agreement between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom to jointly produce nuclear-powered submarines for Australia and the new generation of nuclear subs for the UK and for the United States as well. And more recently still, we've had the Defence Strategic Review, which has been the most significant review of Australian armed forces for the last 30 years. And we've seen new roles for Army in particular, where the Army is now going to be expected to be able to fight and win in a maritime environment rather than be focused primarily as a continental fighting force. So there's a lot going on in this space. And there's a lot of jobs as well, a lot of opportunities in this space. So in government, they're hungry for graduates with skills in strategic thinking, defense analysis, that can step up and help deliver the AUKUS submarines, but also some of the objectives in the Defence Strategic Review. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now so we can talk a bit more about the master's program offered by Macquarie University and some of the different points of difference between our degree and some of the other degrees that you might have available to you. So start to share. Okay, so tonight we're going to be primarily talking about the Master of Security and Strategic Studies before my colleagues join us to talk about some of our other masters. So we offer 5 different master's degrees in the Department of Security Studies and Criminology: the Master of Counterterrorism, the Master of Criminology, the Master of Cybersecurity Analysis, the Master of Intelligence, and the Master of Strategic and Security Studies, which I'll be talking about tonight. They're offered as either 1 year or 1.5 year programs, depending upon your entry level. So if you have a WAM, so that's basically a grade point average, higher than 65, they funnel you towards the 1 year masters. If you have a grade point average, a WAM lower than 65, they tend to channel you towards the 1.5 year program. In addition to that, however, if coursework isn't for you, perhaps you have a greater interest in research, we also offer a Master of Research, which is a 2-year program. Now, if you want a combination of both coursework and research, if you undertake the coursework master's program, you can then leapfrog the first year of the Master of Research, which is primarily research training, and go straight into the second year of the Master of Research. And so you can get the 2 for the price of 1. So for over a 2-year program, you can get the coursework over the first year and then the thesis in the second year, and you get both your Master of one of these coursework programs and the Master of Research after that. After the Master of Research, we then offer a PhD program if that is for your liking. Okay, so strategic studies is what I'm going to be talking primarily about tonight. Strategic studies is the interdisciplinary study of the use of force. So it is not just about war and armed conflict, but also the peacetime use of armed forces. So this includes things like deterrence, compellence, coercion, alliance formation, the use of, say, warships, not just for fighting wars, but also for things like naval diplomacy as well. So the use of armed force to shape the international environment. Because ultimately, if we're successful, hopefully we don't need to fight wars at the end of the day, that we can use our armed forces to get what we want, which is a peaceful and stable region, without needing to resort to actual violence. So we offer units within this course, this program, that will analyze and pull apart not just war and war fighting, but also the use of armed forces to achieve your objectives without fighting. So what are some of the points of difference between Macquarie and some other courses that you might be looking at in strategic studies and defence studies around Sydney and further afield? Well, for that, we might want to take a step back and ask, well, what is strategy to begin with? Now, strategy is the art of science of using available means to achieve high-end objectives in situations where there is an actor that's actively looking to achieve their own goals at the same time. So the key difference between, say, a program, a policy, and strategy is that strategy has another actor involved in the activity, right? You're trying to attempt to anticipate what another actor is going to do, and you're making decisions based upon what you expect them to do. But they're also trying to anticipate what you're going to do. So it's a game of chess. So we see games of strategy or battles of wits in all sorts of different situations. In a game of soccer, the rival coaches are trying to outwit the other coach about, what are you going to bring on a striker? Are you going to bring on a defender? If you bring a defender, what are they going to do? So you're trying to anticipate what the other coach is going to do and get 2 moves ahead. It's a game of chess, right? And trying to anticipate your opponent's next move and trying to get ahead of them. Now, to do this effectively, to be an effective strategist, you need to understand your opponent. So you need to be able to see the world through their eyes. So this involves being able to anticipate what your opponent's future moves are going to be, so that you can either prevent them, you can ambush them, or you can exploit their mistakes in order to benefit yourself. So what this means is that you have to have a deep cultural and historical understanding of your opponent. You need to not only be able to see the world through their eyes, but you need to be able to feel the world like they feel the world, experience the world like they experience the world. And if you can do that, if you can put yourself in their shoes, you can then anticipate what they're going to do and you can beat them. And so one of the distinguishing features of strategic studies at Macquarie University is the range of backgrounds that our lecturers and our professors bring to the study of strategic studies. We have area experts in China, in India, on the United States, that can teach you not just about strategy, but you can learn about the cultural, historical, political backgrounds of the major actors in our region, so that you can learn more about how they experience the world, how they see the world, their foreign policy objectives. You can anticipate what they're going to do, and we can beat them. So a second part of strategic studies, which is vitally important, is to be able to get experience in strategy making. And this is one of the distinguishing features of strategic studies at Macquarie University, where we emphasize simulations and wargaming in our teaching, so that students are going to be placed in the position where they're going to need to make these strategic decisions themselves. And you can learn from your mistakes. So it's not as though you're always going to win one of these war games, but it's much better to try and to fail in the classroom and learn from your mistakes than to do it on the job in the real world. And you can take your experiences in simulations and wargaming, you can learn from this, and then you can apply the skills and the knowledge that you've applied to these real world situations. So it's not just going to be book learning that you often get in other programs. It's not as though you're just going to be sitting there and absorbing information, being lectured to week on week. You'll be doing strategy as well. And finally, one of the distinguishing features of strategic studies at Macquarie University compared to others is that we try to achieve a balance between practical and scholarly knowledge. So some of the other programs that you might find out there emphasize practical knowledge, that when you look at the degree, it's essentially a vocational program where it's like almost like a TAFE program where you're just learning how to do a job. Other universities that offer programs like this offer courses that are far more theoretical and conceptual. So they sit up in their ivory tower and they ruminate about concepts and theories without ever getting down and applying them to real world cases. So what Macquarie tries to do is achieve both. We try and achieve a balance between these two different things, to give students practical knowledge about how decisions are made in the real world, and to learn from practitioners who have been in situations of making these strategic decisions in the past, but also being able to teach students about the necessary theoretical scholarly grounding to give the degree the academic rigor that can only be achieved by a university program such as that offered by Macquarie University. So we try and strike this balance between the two, which I think makes Macquarie unique and one of the most valuable parts of our program study. So if you have a look at what you'll be learning in the Strategic Studies program, we can see that we start off with critical thought and research design. This offers students an opportunity to develop their critical thinking skills, but also some of the academic skills they'll need to succeed, not just in the master's program, but also in their future careers. We then offer strategic thinking, which goes back to many of the aspects I've already touched upon briefly. When we're trying to form a strategy, what are some of the key aspects of forming a strategy that's going to make it successful? We look at geopolitics and geostrategy. These are some of the geopolitical trends across the Indo-Pacific in particular that might be triggers for war and conflict in the future. We look at my course, Australia's Strategic and Defence Policy, where we take a closer look at Australia's strategic challenges. And then we look at transnational security, which is a broader look at some of the issues that are not just in terms of war and peace, but things like peacekeeping and what have you. And finally, we have a simulation unit where students are offered an opportunity to apply the skills that they've learned in the program to real world scenarios. Here, you'll join up with other students from other master's programs, so from intelligence, from cyber, from criminology and counterterrorism, to deal with scenarios that could actually happen in the future. It could be a crisis in the South China Sea, it could be loose nukes in Central Asia, and you'll be asked to perform the role of the strategist in this group and deal with making real world decisions in response to these crises. And you also have an opportunity to take 2 electives. There's an international study tour, there's internships. We can take a unit from one of the other master's programs to get a broader experience. And we also offer a supervised project. So if during your program of study, there's been a topic that's been particularly interesting to you, you can then focus on that, and under the supervision of one of our professors, you can write a 6,000 word research paper on that topic. So some of the future careers, well, there's a lot going around right now. I have 3rd year undergraduates in my Bachelor of Security Studies, and the ADF is throwing money at them to try and lock them in to future careers in the ADF. But our graduates go on to a broader range of jobs besides just the Defence Force. We have graduates that go off to Foreign Affairs. They work in the Defence Department as civilians, Homeland Security. We have graduates that have gone off to Treasury. They also go off to private industry, so off to defence industry, so things like Thales, for example, but they also go off to industries like Qantas, BAE, so they're the ones that are at North Ryde near Macquarie Park that are building our frigates, Optus and other organisations. But also agencies such as the Australian Defence Force, ASIO, AFP, ASIS, which are the international spies, the Defence Forces, but they also go off to ABC, academia and think tanks. So they really do spray. So I think that a lot of our graduates come into the program expecting or hoping to get jobs in the Department of Defence, but when they go on the job market, they're surprised by how attractive they are to other employers, and they end up in all sorts of exciting places. Finally, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the graduate certificate in security studies and criminology. So this is a shorter course. If you're not sure that a whole master's degree is right for you at present, perhaps you'd like to enroll in the graduate certificate, which is a 6-month program, full-time equivalent, where if you undertake the graduate certificate and you'd like to then transfer into one of our master's programs, you can. So you take the units that you've gained, the academic credit you've gained in the graduate certificate, and then you can transfer into the master's program. Alternately, you can just graduate with the graduate certificate if that's what you want to do. But it's also an exit degree as well. So sometimes life gets in the way. You might start on the path of the master's program in any one of our 5 master's programs. You might get a job offer. Your life circumstances change for whatever reason. And if you need to exit the master's program after 6 months, you can then transfer into the graduate certificate of security studies and criminology, and you can still walk away with a postgraduate qualification. So the essential structure is that you have 10 credit points. So you do critical thought and research design, which is a common unit across all of our master's degrees. So you can take that unit and apply it to the graduate certificate, or you can apply it to one of our master's programs. You then take 2 units, so 20 credit points from one of these units, which is a spread of the from all the master's programs, and then 10 credit points from one of these programs. Add it to 40 credit points, which is 4 units, which is half of a year worth of work. But as you can see, all these units appear in our master's programs as well. And so you can transfer into our master's programs, and if you prefer to jump streams and finish with a master's program. So I'm happy to just take questions now if you have any.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Adam, for such a great introduction. So, yep, I think we'll move on to questions now. So we've got some incredible ones from the audience. So we'll start with those. So from Aston, would the course offer a bit of policy tradecraft experience?
Certainly. So I can speak about my unit in particular, where I focus on Australian defence policy and strategy. And in this course, we look at the historical development of Australian defence policy, and then students are asked to evaluate not only current policy, but also to come with their own recommendations as well. So you can then take that into an interview situation if you're going for a job in the future with an organisation, and if they ask you whether or not you've had experience developing policy, you can say, well, my master's program developed those practical skills, and I have had experience in evaluating policy and also formulating my own policy.
Incredible. So we've got another one from Graham here. So I'll just read out the whole thing. Course sounds very interesting. My interest stems more from a business perspective, i.e. how can businesses deal with emerging issues stemming from geopolitical instability and change? Do any aspects of the course touch on this, i.e. the economic aspects of strategy, thinking of the interaction with sustainability and how that may increase complexity?
Yeah, so there's 2 courses that might be interesting to you. So the first one is a geopolitics and geostrategy unit. This is looking at long-term trends in the Indo-Pacific with a focus on the Indo-Pacific. And that is in part driven by economics. So a lot of commentary that is out there is about there's an arms race in Asia. Look at the massive military buildup in Asia. Well, in part that's correct, but it's not the whole story. Most of this military buildup is being driven by economic growth. And so if you look at the percentage of GDP spent on defense by most of these governments, it hasn't dramatically increased. It's just they're becoming more wealthy. And so we do look at the economic aspects of that. But we also look at some of the issues around international trade and economic policies as a dampener on international conflict and competition. So one of the dampeners on competition between the United States and China, for example, is how economically interdependent they are. And it makes absolutely no sense to shoot your customer, right? And so while these two countries are economically independent, as there's a lot of American multinationals that have set up shop and see their futures in getting rich off the Chinese market, they're applying a lot of pressure back onto DC to make sure that things don't spiral out of control. So certainly economics does, and business plays a key role in strategic studies and geopolitics.
Incredible. Thank you so much. So we've got some time for just a few others. So we've got one from an anonymous attendee. So would there be guest lecturers from the field to teach us? And are we able to connect with the industry speakers?
Yeah, so the geopolitics one in particular gets a range of guest speakers coming in when we're starting to work through the different countries, so different perspectives from different countries like Indonesia, China, Japan. Guest speakers are often invited in for those topics to get expert opinion on those particular weeks. And we also bring in guests to speak on in the defence topic as well. And students are able to connect with them, particularly in some of the smaller units. So some of the units are larger, some are smaller. So in my defence unit, we have somewhere between class size for the internal students are about 15 students. So these can be more intimate. We get to know our students really well. They get to know us very well, and they get a lot of face time with not just the professors, but also for any guests that we get in during the course of the semester.
Incredible. And I think we'll squeeze this last one in before we end this session. So are there any scholarship opportunities for disadvantaged students? And I would just like to point out that if, Adam, you're not able to answer this, not sure, please do keep in mind to this attendee that you can reach out to the postgraduate team either by phone or by email for your specific circumstance. But I will throw it over to you, Adam, if you've got anything.
Yeah, I might just pass this one over to you, Bridget, because I know that Macquarie University has a range of different programs, but I'm not familiar with all of them.
No worries. So to that attendee, we do reach out to the postgraduate team. You'll get their contact details in 2 seconds. And very last question, if we answer it very quickly, Adam, will we get the opportunity to speak and network with people in the field with organisations such as ASD, ASIO, etc.?
Well, I can't tell you about exactly where all of our guests come from, but they work for government, but I can't say more than that. But if you want to throw out words like, ASIO and ASIS, that's up to you.
Beautiful. And with that last question, I think we'll bring this session to an end. So thank you, Adam, for sharing your expert knowledge in the Master of Security and Strategic Studies, and also the Graduate Certificate of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Bridget.
And for our audience, if we didn't get to your question, you can contact our postgraduate team on 02 9850 6791 or email postgraduate@mq.edu.au. And we very much look forward to supporting your learning at Macquarie University. So I would now like to welcome to our session on the Master of Counterterrorism with Dr. Mariam Farida. Mariam, welcome. Amazing.
Hi, Bridget. Hello, everyone.
I'll hand over to you, Mariam.
All right. So Adam spoke about the strategic studies, and the counterterrorism is next. I'll just start sharing my screen so you can see a little bit of the information that I have set. Okay, let me just make sure that we've got slides. And there we go. All right, so just a little bit of a brief background about how the Master of Counterterrorism started in Macquarie University. So the department started as a center for policing, intelligence, and counterterrorism back in 2005. And that came as a response to the threat of terrorism, more specifically following the US 2001 9/11 attacks and the Bali 2001 and 2002 attacks, as well as with 2005. So there was an increased force to try to focus on the issue of terrorism and counterterrorism in Australia. So the center was then conceived as a way to bridge the applied aspect of the field with the theoretical aspect as well. So the center was then put forward to try to bridge together the practitioners along with academics and researchers, and try to bring the scholarly research into these domains. So in the center, it was staffed by some former senior practitioners and some academics with relevant practical experience. So it started as that was the inception or the need to create such a center to try to articulate what were the motivations behind people resorting to terrorism, or some of the motivations behind people radicalizing or engaging with violence, and so on and so forth. And that was also seen as a necessity from the government itself. So in 2016, after the center has proven that it was successful in trying to bridge the gap, and because of the applied experience that the staff had, the center was then successfully upgraded into a full university department. So it was then called the Department of Security Studies and Criminology, which it still stands with its name until now. So the department was opened by former Prime Minister John Howard in 2016, and it's headed now by Professor James Ramsey, who's the head of the department. So, but this is just a bit of a background of why the department was created, to what end, who actually participated in the creation of this department, and how much it was a need for such a niche area to receive the greatest support from the government. So, but what does it mean actually to study counterterrorism? And why is it important to study counterterrorism? Well, it's basically the thing that it's a global phenomenon. Terrorism is a global phenomenon that is still surrounding us as we live in, and it will continue to be a dangerous phenomenon until the future. So if you see the news, if you follow the latest ASIO reports, if you even just look at brief global terrorism index, it shows you that terrorism in its different format and its different forms still continues to be the greatest threat. And here we're not really specifying which kind of terrorism. It could be ideological, it could be racial, and so on and so forth. So these are the kind of questions that we try to articulate in this stream in the Masters of Counterterrorism. So what we try to teach, or to get you to understand, is you first get to gain the latest research-based knowledge of terrorism. So you get to understand what are the challenges in researching terrorism. It's not easy just to go on into the field and try to, research failed suicide bombers, for example. That is a very dangerous and very challenging thing to do. So acquiring data is a very challenging thing to do. But what you get to speak to are hands-on practitioners who have dealt with these sort of individuals, for example. And also with researchers or academics who have conducted fieldwork and research on this particular topic. So you get to then understand also not only the motivations towards terrorism, but also some counterterrorism strategies. So in that, we lean on a lot of the knowledge of the practitioners themselves who take part in writing these policies themselves. And more or less, our students become those policymakers eventually. So I'll talk to you through a little bit about where does your career take you when you're studying counterterrorism or terrorism more generally. But let's just stay with, what does it mean? What do we study when we're studying in the Masters of Counterterrorism? So first, questions like what motivates a person to engage in violence? What makes someone decide to spread and to join an ideology which more or less fosters extremist views and in a way use violence in the pursuing of these ideas? And then if we talk about religious terrorism, what does it mean when we talk about religious terrorism? What kind of ideology ingrained in that understanding? And then different theories about, psychological aspect of people becoming engaged or in violence. We talk about networking and the issue with belonging. We talk about grievances as well, which also can be a big part of people feeling that they do not belong in the place that they are living in their host country. Instead, they try to look for an outer belonging. And we also look at the in-group and the out-group feelings when some of these groups they take the sort of dehumanizing the other in a way to try to it becomes legitimate to commit acts of terrorism or acts of violence towards that group or those individuals. So all of these questions that come in mind about those particular individuals that become engaged with violence are the sort of things that we try to unpack and examine in this master's and in these courses. And similarly, just like we try to examine the ways in which people become engaged in terrorism, we try to also look at the ways that we can look at people de-radicalizing and disengaging from violence. So we have a range of programs that are prison-based, that are government-funded in Australia and globally. And we try to look at them and assess to what extent are they successful and are they fit for purpose. So all of these examples, all of these case studies, and all of these knowledge is shared in the classrooms as we move towards the master's component. So what we do is we provide cutting edge and in-depth coverage of terrorism issues at the most strategic level. So you then engage in a simulation and scenario exercise. So the course that Adam was talking about briefly is where the CT stream students can sit and participate and engage in what they've learned about CT in order to solve that scenario exercise that they are involved in. And not only that, it's the great opportunity, and I do want to stress on the great opportunity that you get to mix with experienced security professionals within your class. So in the CT program or the Masters of CT, we tend to have a range of students who are coming from overseas and from within Australia who are from practicing or industry-based, who are wanting to upskill and learn more and gain a higher certificate. And we also have more of a junior students who are going towards from their bachelor into their master's stream and so on. So that mix of industry and non-industry based students is a great ground for students to benefit from each other's experience. So for example, in many of my students, I would have people from the AFP, for example, who are in the class, people from correctives, they would come and take the master's stream, and they bring in the experience that they have and the industry knowledge that they have and share to a certain extent in the classroom. So students find that peer-to-peer support and knowledge much more valuable than only just learning about theory, but it's the actually applied practice that plays a big role in the discussion that we have in our classes. So you will be then exposed to real-world expert knowledge from industry partners, like I said, such as corrections, counterterrorism units, intelligence units, because we hold a lot of the guest lectures that come into the classes. And they then try to speak to the students about their experience back in the units. So for example, we have in one of the courses, in one of the weeks, we try to examine counterterrorism programs in Australia as a case study. So we invite someone from the counterterrorism programs in corrective services, and they speak to us about the cohort that they have in the program, the kind of services they provide. They give us a little bit of insight about what the program include, and most importantly, the challenges of working with such a cohort, and what does that mean in terms of the effectiveness of the program itself. So that kind of industry-based and expert knowledge is really valuable, because it not only equips students with real-world scenarios, but it also helps them to understand not only the theoretical aspect of terrorism and counterterrorism, but also the application of what they've learned in class. So not everything is just based on the theories that you have studied, but also how do you apply such a theory? So for example, if by doing the master's, you then are able to identify what are the main factors, or the push and the pull factors, as they call them, to persuade or to motivate someone to become engaged with violence, you will then be able to articulate that into a counterterrorism policy, and to try to then situate what would be the pull factors or the push factors for that particular individual in that city program or disengagement program that will actually stir them away from violence. And then not only that, you look at if the context is ready enough for that person to become disengaged or not. Because just like people engage with violence at different times because of different circumstances, they also disengage at different times because of different circumstances. And then you as a student will be able to identify all of this complexity based on real life and real world scenario. So in a nutshell, if I was just to summarize exactly what you learn, is those emerging domestic, regional, and international challenges that are related to terrorism. And here we can speak about, stuff about racism, and most recently COVID-19 and the pandemic, how it was a hindrance, and it was a push for a lot of the young people, especially the youth population, because they were isolated and they were online most of the time, unsupervised. And all of the messaging that was involved in the anti-vaccine, anti-government narrative around COVID-19. So all of that, it was a push for many of those youth to become mobilized and radicalized online. So that is a domestic challenge. And the pandemic itself gave a very unique phenomenon for us as terrorist researchers to look at the pandemic as a fertile ground, and to try to motivate people and mobilize them to join radical groups. And also we look at some of the rise of online gaming and online radicalization, and how that itself also provides a challenging aspect to studying terrorism. So similarly, just like you look at those emerging challenges, you then try to see and situate them with the implications for counterterrorism approaches. So what does that mean? If you're trying to create a counterterrorism policy against online radicalization, you really must know the factors that would lead someone who is from that particular demographic, who is heavily online, unsupervised, is into the gaming industry or the dark net, etc. And how does that translate into you writing or understanding counterterrorism policy? And that eventually takes on a much bigger debate and a much bigger argument on what works and what doesn't work, what applies in Australia and what doesn't apply in Australia. So you'll also learn, which is more importantly, then how to deal with the spread of radical ideology. So you'll understand what does it mean to harbor radical ideologies and radical ideas. What are the different ideologies that some of these extremist groups harbor and focus on? How do they mobilize? So tools of mobilization. If it's online, then how do they mobilize online? What kind of platforms do they use? What kind of messaging do they use? Do they target a certain demographic? Like I said, in the case of the pandemic, it was much more towards a younger demographic. Well, what does that mean? And even like when we talk about kind of narratives or messaging that some of these groups try to target, we all use online platforms, and we are all kind of subject to this kind of messaging. So it's really important to then learn how to protect yourself and shield yourself from those messaging, and to what end would that lead. So the online media platforms are becoming increasingly challenging to try to look out for these kind of narratives. So these are the kind of things that in the masters that we have, in the courses that we have in the counterterrorism, we try to articulate and we try to unpack. I mean, there's many, many more things that we try to focus on as well. So even in issues like the international implications in terms of terrorism, we try to look at conflict, for example, or try to look at some of the colonial aspect, if that carries with it some grievances that might push for some groups to use that sort of narrative to mobilize. And a great example of that is the spread and the resurgence of ISIS, and what kind of grievances they were tapping on in order to mobilize foreign fighters to leave their countries and come to Syria to fight there. And especially this kind of discussion is important nowadays with the repatriation of the ISIS wives and children. So the conversation around terrorism and counterterrorism is an ever-recurring, continuing discussion. And it will continue to be part of, this discussion that we have around belonging, around protection of liberty, about freedom of religion, freedom of speech, about respect of each other, and about racism and all of and ethnic discrimination and all that. So all of this is packed in the information and the topics that we try to cover in the courses that we have in terrorism and counterterrorism. So it's a really multifaceted, multi-layered sort of stream. But it does answer to what does really lead someone to become engaged in terrorism, and what might be the factors that you can persuade or use to disengage them from violence. So in the sort of jobs that you're looking at in terms of counterterrorism, a lot of our students end up in the Department of Homeland Affairs and AFP. Many of our students who go into the internship unit, which is an elective unit in this stream, and I'll show you in a little bit, they just go for an internship for 12 weeks. And by the end of the 12 weeks, they end up with a contract on their table. So these internships can be in different government agencies, but also in think tanks and organizations like KPMG, like Thales, like Center for Armed Violence. So all of these organizations and industries are craving for this sort of knowledge that the students bring, that our students bring back into these industries, and also because our department has the reputation of having experts in these academic roles, and not only based on their research capacity, but also from their industry experience itself. So I myself have been working with the counterterrorism unit in corrective services as a consultant. So I have overseen some of these counterterrorism programs myself, and I have worked with inmates directly. And I tried to articulate some of the challenges and some of the problems with some of the policies that we have, CT policies in place. And that knowledge and that expertise has definitely been a really good value to my students as I bring into the classrooms. And that is exactly what is needed. It's not just the theoretical aspect of the stream, but also the application of it, because we don't want to send you out to the world just with the theoretical part of this information, but also how do you apply this sort of knowledge in the workplace. So just quickly, the jobs that you might land if you study CT, they include fraud investigations, for example, counterterrorism officers, definitely analysts. And we have a lot of government agencies, intelligence units who always email us and say, do you have any students for us that we can employ? We really want more people from Macquarie, from the department specifically, to come and work for us. Scenario scanning is another opportunity for jobs. And also, like I said, security strategy for big private sectors like KPMG and etc. So just quickly with the security studies, the masters, I think Adam already covered some of it, but I'll just go quickly go through this one. So the Masters of Counterterrorism sits next to 4 other master's streams, Security and Strategic Studies that Adam spoke about, Master of Intelligence, Cybersecurity, and Master of Criminology. And then you've got 1 methodology unit and 4 core units. The simulation is the one that I said, it houses students from all different streams, and they bring that knowledge that they have learned from the courses that they've done, and they try to work out a scenario and become a policy briefs. They write a brief for the Department of Defense. So it's a really cool kind of experience that students go to. So just quickly, some of the essential units for the CT stream are the Critical Thought and Research Design by Jennifer. And then we've got the CT in the Global and Australian Context by myself, and then Advanced Terrorism Studies by Julian, Pathways into Terrorism by myself again, and then International Terrorism by Andrew. And then you've got the simulation unit as an essential unit for that stream as well. So you see that there's a different variety of what sort of level of terrorism we can learn about. And then every course offers a different articulation of those different challenges for what does it mean to be engaged in terrorism, more domestically and then globally in general. Some of the elective units that you can also look at when you're doing the CT stream is the supervised project that Adam was talking about, 8047. And then there's the study tour. The internship is the 8016 is the one that I was talking about, where our master students really enjoy having that real life experience with industry. And like I said, the employment rate after the end of the internship is almost always 80%. So by the end of the internship, students are given an employment contract, and that is a very huge success of the internship program. And it's a really good demonstration of the efficiency of the students that they have here in terms of the knowledge and the industry experience. And then lastly, there's the wide range of intelligence theory, geopolitics, criminology, and then information warfare. So these are some of the elective units that you can think about to bring alongside when you're doing your Masters of Counterterrorism. But in a nutshell, it's a really cool stream to study, especially if you have an inquisitive character, if you really want to dig in and learn what really persuades people to be involved in a radical ideology. And then if you really want to become a policymaker, this is the stream for you, because it equips you to become in that position of making a decision around writing policies that can change people's lives. And I think this is my share. I'll just stop sharing for a bit.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Mariam, for sharing your knowledge on the Master of Counterterrorism. So we'll now open up for questions. So first question is, what skills are required to be a successful counterterrorism analyst?
So if I was just to summarize it, the skills that you bring with you would be closer to problem-solving skills and some analytical skills. So like I said, you'll be given a different array of theories of what, people factors or push them to become involved with violence and engaged with violence. The issue is not to stop there, but try to dig a little bit deeper and understand why. So why would someone who is of those specific characteristics, that particular demographic or ethnic background, living in X place or context or environment, pushes them to become involved in violence? So the questions behind the why is the essence of what we try to do in the stream or the Masters of Terrorism and Counterterrorism. And then from that, when you know the why, you can put the how you can overcome those factors, which is what takes you to become a policymaker in the CT environment later on.
Incredible. So we've got one from our guest here. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, but can current CVE practitioners receive recognition of prior learning for industry work, or is it only for previous study?
So that is an excellent question. I don't think I have the answer for it, but I believe there is a discussion around that. Maybe
I'm so sorry. I might be able to jump in here. I do know that for RPL, for postgraduate students, you can get recognition for previous work experience. It is done on a case-by-case basis, so there's no guarantee, but definitely have a look into it. But it is a possibility. So we've got another question here. That's all right. Nice and easy, hopefully. How long is the course full time?
So if I'm not mistaken, it's a year and a half, or yeah, so it's a year and a half, I think, the masters of CT, and that it depends if they're doing double masters or not. So I think it's a year and a half full time if they're just doing one master stream.
Amazing. So another question for you. I'll just read it out to you. At my current uni, the course coordinators, the people who are the face of the university, don't actually teach. Do today's speakers do the teaching, or is it done by contracted tutors?
Good question. No, it will be done. So some of the lectures will have the lecturers, and then the tutorials will be run by tutors, casual tutors, but the face-to-face teaching in the lectures will be predominantly by lecturers themselves.
Incredible. So just a quick one. Someone's just asking, where did you earn your PhD?
Surprise, surprise, Macquarie University, Department of Security Studies and Criminology.
Perfect answer.
Yeah.
Alrighty, another one here for you. So I'm particularly interested in criminology as well as counterterrorism. Is the internship the same for both masters, or are they different? And then secondly, following on from that, could you explain some of the applications of the counterterrorism degree within the Australian Federal Police as a follow-on career?
So just with the internship, if you are, so you must be doing your master's in terrorism and counterterrorism. I'll double check if you can be doing your master's of criminology, because I think you can, as long as you have a 70 on as a WAM, and you are enrolled in a master's program. So you should be able, even if you're doing criminology. And then the second question, remind me.
Sure, no worries. Explain some of the applications of the counterterrorism degree within their AFP as a follow-on career.
So it depends if you have some background experience with the AFP, or if you just want to build that sort of a career with AFP. But you can end up in their CT unit or their Intel unit. Again, it depends if you just want to do the master's in terrorism, counterterrorism, or if you're interested in doing a double master's of, let's say, policing and counterterrorism. So that would be probably a bigger sort of opportunity to broaden your horizon. It really depends on what the person wants from their career. But in AFP, we do house a lot of AFP practitioners, and they come and do their masters with us in CT. But again, it differs if they are already AFP practitioners and they are employees there, or if they're a student who wishes to eventually end up in AFP, which we have both. It just depends what the student wishes to go through in which aspect. Yeah.
Amazing. So that was our last question, and it brings us to the end of this session. So thank you, Mariam, for sharing your insights into the Master of Counterterrorism at Macquarie, and it was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
And for our audience, if we didn't get to your question, you can contact our postgraduate team on 02 9850 6791 or email postgraduate@mq.edu.au. And we're very much looking forward to supporting your learning at Macquarie University. So this brings us on to our next session. So welcome to our session on Macquarie's Master of Intelligence. And I'm pleased to introduce you to Course Director, Dr. Brian Cuddy. Brian, welcome.
Thanks very much, Bridget. So I'll jump in and start talking about the Master of Intelligence. Let me share a few slides to start with, and then when we get to some Q&A, I'll turn them off and we can get to your questions. So As Bridget said, my name is Brian Cuddy, and I teach here in the Master of Intelligence. I used to work in intelligence before I became an academic, and that's sort of how I ended up teaching here at Macquarie University in this stream. So what is, first of all, what is intelligence, right? So what is the purpose and process of intelligence, as I've got up there? And of course, intelligence is sort of saturated in popular culture, right? There's lots of TV shows, lots of movies you can watch to get a sense of intelligence. I think for me, what intelligence is really all about, if I were to sum it up, it's about reducing uncertainty for decision makers, right? I've got up there a shot of the cover of Foreign Affairs magazine. For those of you who follow foreign affairs and discussions about international politics and the like, this is sort of a preeminent magazine journal coming out of the United States on foreign policy issues. Their 100th anniversary issue towards the end of last year, they came up with this idea of the age of uncertainty, right? That we're living in an age of uncertainty that seems much more opaque, perhaps, than recent history, right? So there you see on their cover, you can see a person in a yellow rain jacket holding up a lantern, right? Trying to give some light into this age of uncertainty. And I guess that's sort of what intelligence does, right? Intelligence, the intelligence officer, intelligence analyst is that person in the yellow rain jacket, right? Trying to shed some light on things for decision makers, so that we in Australia or wherever you are can navigate these uncertain times as best we can. So how does the process of intelligence then sort of unravel from that or unwind from that? So obviously, partly it's about collecting intelligence, right? And in popular culture and movies and stuff, it's this that often gets sort of put front and center, right? We have various ways in which we collect intelligence: intercepting electronic communications, good old-fashioned espionage, satellite imagery, and open sources, of which there are many today. Many of those things are quite technical, right? And in our degree in the Master of Intelligence here in the Faculty of Arts, we're not really teaching the engineering or the science behind some of those methods of collection, right? But collecting is only one part of intelligence, right? Collecting good information is not enough, as I've got up there on the screen. Intelligence is also about putting that information together, interpreting it, analysing it in such a way as to provide a rigorous and honest assessment. So that's the second step. You know, you collect the information, then you have to analyse it. The third step, sometimes, and if you're familiar with intelligence, if you've done some intelligence units as an undergrad, you'll recognise sometimes this is talked about as a cycle, the intelligence cycle. But the final step of 3 that I've got up there is that intelligence has to be presented in clear, concise, and useful terms to decision makers, right? This is sometimes what separates intelligence from other sort of information or knowledge workplaces, right? That it has to be useful, it has to be timely. Decision makers need to get this information in order to base important policy decisions on them. So that, I think, is what intelligence is about, right? We collect information, we analyze that, we deliver it to decision makers so that they can make better decisions, so that they can act in a situation of reduced uncertainty. Now that, if you were to go to most intelligence programs around the place, that's a sort of the basic setup of intelligence that you're going to get. At Macquarie, we do that, and we teach these core skills of intelligence. We also, I think, can do things that perhaps other programs can't. So one of the things that we do is a global perspective on intelligence, right? We do certainly focus on Australia, right? And not just Australia, but at the state level too. So New South Wales, for example, we have some good, strong connections to New South Wales Police in the intelligence space. So we go from that local context up to the national context. One of our lecturers, Dr. Melanie Brand, or soon to be Dr. Melanie Brand, is an expert on Australian intelligence, and particularly on the evolution of how governments and publics have put in place mechanisms of oversight for intelligence, right? Because intelligence agencies operate in secretive and often closed environments, there needs to be some sort of oversight for those agencies, right? And so Melanie's looking at some of those things within the Australian context. But we also go beyond Australia, right? We think about intelligence as a process that operates globally. So one of our other lecturers, Dr. Tsepo Guatiwa, looks at African intelligence, right? And his research looks at African intelligence, different countries within Africa, and also different types of intelligence and how they're being used by governments around the world. Finally, a new head of the department in security studies and criminology, a guy, Dr. James Ramsey. He's had a long history of intelligence education within the United States, right? So he's bringing some of those American perspectives. I myself worked in New Zealand intelligence, but also most of my research deals with the United States as well. I'm a historian by training, and so look at some of those episodes of intelligence success and failure within history, and particularly US history. So the team that we have teaching in the Master of Intelligence takes a global perspective on this topic. It's also, as I mentioned, not just national security intelligence. So we do a lot of national security intelligence, right? That's my background. When I worked in intelligence, I was tasked, my portfolio involved looking at a particular area of the world, trying to gauge intentions and capabilities of foreign governments in that area, what that meant to my own government, right? How did the interests of my government intersect with those, and then disseminate those assessments to the Prime Minister of the day, right? So I was mostly working at the strategic national security level of intelligence. As I mentioned, though, that's not the only type of intelligence. So we've got, as I said, close connections to law enforcement intelligence. Dr. Guatiwa, I mentioned, is doing some interesting work in the African context, looking at things like poaching and how intelligence processes can help in combating poaching in some African countries. Got a student at the moment looking in a similar vein, how can intelligence processes be used to try and curtail the market in forged and stolen art or antiquities, right? So we take not just a global perspective on intelligence, but quite a broad perspective on what intelligence is and where intelligence can be used, whilst, of course, I think maintaining that core on national security intelligence. So that's sort of a bit about our staff who teach into the Master of Intelligence. Let me sort of dig into perhaps one particular unit that sort of gets at that intelligence cycle, or gets into a particular part of the intelligence cycle a little bit more. And that's picked 8044, which is called intelligence analysis. So intelligence theory suggests that while there are difficult technical problems on the collection side of intelligence, and as I mentioned earlier, right, some of those questions of engineering and science we don't deal with in our program. But whilst we don't teach them because different parts of the university teach those things, we also focus on other areas because it's actually other areas that are often deemed to be the most susceptible to intelligence failure, right? So intelligence theory suggests that it's in the areas of intelligence analysis and the relationship between intelligence agencies and decision makers where the main problems arise. So where I put those three steps, right? Collection, analysis, and then dissemination to the policymakers or decision makers. It's in those second two steps where we tend to get a lot of the problems with intelligence, right? In analysis and in how that analysis is presented or used by decision makers. Most of the time, it's not a question of having a lack of information, right? Usually the information is there. Most often the problems come in analysing that information, putting it together, and then in the way it's used by decision makers. So those second and third steps in that process or that cycle, right, analysis and presenting that information to decision makers are really key. And we tend to focus on those two steps a lot in the program. Certainly in my unit, I teach a unit 8013 at the moment called History of Intelligence. We look at case studies of intelligence failure, a little bit about success too, but looking at these questions of where intelligence hasn't worked properly in order to try and ascertain how to do it better in the future, right? And obviously, because intelligence is secretive, is a closed system in some respects, using those historical case studies provides a good way of learning about these questions of what makes for successful intelligence, what factors lead to intelligence failures. So in our units, we'll look at these big conceptual debates about where intelligence problems occur. I've got a picture up there. Many of you will know the face. It's Colin Powell, the former Secretary of State, just died recently actually, but he was the Secretary of State in 2003 when the United States launched the Iraq War. Right? You might have seen quite a few news stories and the like a month or two ago on the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq by the United States. That operation was justified in different ways, but one of the ways that operation was justified was because it was assessed that the Iraqis, Saddam Hussein and his government maintained weapons of mass destruction. And so this particular photo was of Colin Powell going to the UN Security Council and making the case that Iraq still had weapons of mass destruction. That turned out not to be true, right? And so one of the case studies in 8013, this unit that I teach, for example, will look at this as a moment of intelligence failure. How did this failure occur? And others like it, right? The Pearl Harbor, going back to World War II, the Vietnam War, Iraq, right? There's a series of case studies that we go through. Why did intelligence fail? And again, looking much more closely at that second and third step in the cycle. Now, we don't just want to be a program that teaches you about the problems and the failures of intelligence, right? We want to use our understanding of those problems and failures in order to make you better part of the intelligence workforce in the future. So we'll also want to give you some very practical skills to help you navigate those problems as a member of the intelligence workforce. And this is where I'm getting to the point about talking a little bit about PICT 8044 or intelligence analysis. So in 8044, you'll cover what we call in the intelligence game structured analytic techniques or SATs. These have arisen over the last really half century or so, principally coming out of the American intelligence community as a way to try and reduce those analytical problems, right? Those failures that happen in that analysis stage of the intelligence process. So we'll cover in 8044, you'll cover some of these different techniques that have been devised really to try and reduce the bias of the analyst, right? And of the team of analysts or the community of analysts in a national context. Issues of cognitive bias, of groupthink, right? These are some of the issues that plague intelligence. And so these structured analytic techniques have been developed, as I said, over recent decades in order to help intelligence communities, and particularly the analytic workforce within intelligence communities, in order to reduce those biases, in order to try and get people to think of multiple possibilities, right? Not just to think along the same path. And so I just pulled up one from a US government tradecraft primer on structured analytic techniques for improving intelligence analysis. This one is alternative futures analysis. There's a whole series of these sort of tools or hypotheses that you can go through and that you'll learn about and apply within PICT 8044 as a way to make you a better intelligence analyst, right? And so this particular one, alternative futures analysis, this applies sort of a risk assessment along with the sort of the impact assessment of what hypothetical threats to the homeland in the United States might be, right? Some of these tools are quite simple, really, right? It can be used with pen and paper. There's nothing overly technologically complex about some of these tools. But these tools are a way in which the intelligence analyst can check themselves, right? Make sure that they can stop, reflect, be a bit more thoughtful about how they piece that information together. So in terms of career possibilities, I think one thing which I would suggest, and I think as a program that we do encourage, is to think of intelligence as a skill set and a profession rather than merely an organization, right? Lots of us would love to go and work for those big traditional intelligence agencies in Canberra, right? And some of our graduates do. But it's also quite competitive to get those jobs, right? But the good news is that we're increasingly seeing intelligence roles in other government departments, non-national security departments, regulatory agencies, in the private sector, and in NGOs, right? One of our graduates works in a social media company on intelligence-related issues, for example. Some of these roles aren't always pegged as intelligence per se, but they still require those skills of gathering information, analysing it, and using it to help reduce uncertainty for decision makers, right? Those 3 steps that I outlined before. I would, before we move to Q&A, I'd just say one last thing. If you're thinking about a career in intelligence, is that intelligence is for everyone, right? And in both the Australian intelligence community at the moment and also other intelligence communities around the world, there's very much a recognised need for thinkers who approach problems a bit differently, think outside of the box, who bring different life experiences to the task of intelligence, right? So there's much more push at the moment, a real push for a more diverse intelligence workforce. And that makes sense, right? If I said, as I said earlier, if one of the sort of recurring pathologies in intelligence is at this sort of analytical level, right? Things of groupthink and cognitive bias, then getting different people in a room who think differently, have different backgrounds, is actually one way at an organizational level of trying to do things a little bit differently. So I think intelligence communities in the last decade or so are changing in that regard, much more open to a wide variety of backgrounds and skill sets, as well as experiences. So I'll end there, and I will leave us about 10 minutes or so for questions, I think.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing some of your expertise in the intelligence space. So like you said, we'll now open up to the session for the audience Q&A. So first question for you, and I think this follows on from what you were saying earlier. How has intelligence evolved in Australia, and how does studying a Masters of Intelligence prepare students for continuous change?
Yeah, I think intelligence is quite a fast-changing environment in some respects, but I think in other respects there are sort of the fundamentals that we'd like to get across, right? So lots of things are changing, but those fundamental aspects of intelligence, of collecting information, of analysing information, and of making that information useful and relevant for decision makers, those things remain pretty constant, right? And so I think in the Master of Intelligence, one thing we would say is that it's our job as an education provider to get across those fundamentals, right? When you're in an organisation or an intelligence agency, you'll sort of be keeping up to date with those sort of fast changing things. We want to get across those fundamentals. In terms of what is changing, I think I'd mention a few things. One, on the interface between intelligence and the broader society. Intelligence agencies are needing to become much more adept at having a public-facing role, right? So traditionally, they've been very secretive, been very shut off from the public in Australia and in other Five Eyes countries. In recent years, we've seen that changing, right? The Australian intelligence community is recognising that it has to engage with the public. It has to have its mission as being accepted and understood by the Australian public. So you're seeing, for example, the director of ASIO giving annual threat assessments, public speeches, right? This would never have happened in the past, the last few years or so that started. You're seeing much more public outreach by intelligence agencies, both, as I said, in the US and UK have been doing this for a bit longer, but in Australia, we've seen that come to the fore again in recent years. That produces an interesting dynamic, right? In terms of what intelligence work is and in terms of how the public see intelligence. So that's, I think, one key change. Another change is in the quantity of information, right? Now, intelligence analysts will always complain and have complained for probably forever that there's just far too much information, right? This fire hose of information that they have to analyze. And that's true, you know, intelligence as a profession came about through in the sort of the military sphere through the development of general staffs in the 19th century, precisely because military commanders were dealing with too much information. So they needed a specialist set of advisors to help them process this information. In the late 1950s, 1960s, we saw satellites come online, and with the huge amount of information that provided to intelligence communities in the Five Eyes, right? But so we've always had this sort of this narrative of, oh, there's so much information. In recent years, with the sort of the cyber turn and big data, though, we're seeing this quantity of information go into overdrive, right? And that's changing the way the intelligence community deals with information. And so questions of big data, questions of data and analytics, that's something that we're hoping to bring into our program a bit more from next year, right? That we will, the way in which information is being analysed is changing somewhat, right? So that's important to know. I think that's the second big change. Maybe a third big change, building on both of those things, actually, right? The sort of public-facing role of intelligence and the data revolution that's happening, that we're living through at the moment, is the incredible power of open source intelligence, right? And many of you will have become interested in intelligence, perhaps, by seeing what's happening in the open source intelligence space, right? We're seeing members of the public and others use OSINT, open source intelligence tools, to come to understandings of current issues, right? The war in Ukraine is a big one. We've seen a lot of open source intelligence work being done there. Open source intelligence has changed dramatically since my time as an intelligence analyst, when it was mostly around translating foreign newspapers, right? So that you could read what was happening in other countries. Now we're seeing a whole set of tools being developed to make the most of this incredible amount of information that's out there. So I think those are three changes that I'd identify.
Incredible, thank you. So we've got another one. Can you give us, or give the audience, a little bit more information about the study tour unit, e.g. application process, any costs involved?
I'm sorry, yeah, I'm not the person. I think students might need to sort of go through your team, Bridget and Jess's team, to get some information on that. Sorry about that.
No worries at all. So to that attendee, you will see very shortly a phone number and an email address that you can reach out to, and they can give you all the information that you need regarding the study tour. But great question. So I have got one that you definitely will be able to answer here. So Has AI changed the nature of intelligence, and have you addressed this in the degree? Is it increasingly technology driven?
Well, yes and no. I think it sort of comes back to what I was saying about sort of disaggregating between fundamentals and these sort of other changes that's going on, right? How do we distinguish between sort of fundamental of intelligence work through fads? Now, I think AI is changing the whole way in which the knowledge economy, right, or the knowledge workers, of which intelligence professionals are only one part of that. It is going to change the way things happen. There's in our department, in terms of the intelligence program, I think we've got one sort of trial that we're going to participate in about how AI can be used to improve intelligence analysis. That's not, as I understand it, I'm not directly involved with that project, but as I understand it, it's not actually about removing the human entirely from the equation, right, and just having AI write our intelligence assessments for us. But it is about integrating AI into the intelligence process so that we can produce better intelligence assessments, right? And so this project, I think, is going to think about how AI can be used both as a sort of again, another one of those checks on our assessments, another one of those checks on our own biases and our own positions within the intelligence process. And as I sort of suggested, I'm talking about things like structured analytic techniques. The more checks we have on that, then that's all to the good, right? So AI, I think, can be useful there. How it will sort of play out beyond that is we'll sort of keep watching and see what happens. But I think that definitely thinking about ways to integrate it into the process so that it can be useful without removing the human from the equation.
Incredible. And one from Ryan here. So you did mention this briefly, but we'll just make sure we answer every question. So can you speak to the pathway of working in intelligence upon completion of the master's?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would talk about that on the plural, pathways rather than pathway. And as I sort of suggested, going from the local level, state level, within Sydney, within New South Wales, versus the Canberra pathway, or even the non-government pathway, right? We've had graduates go through each of those pathways. Within the internship unit, and I think I sort of heard Marion talk a little bit about the internship unit. So obviously some of those internship placements we can do more effectively at the local level, right? But so that has also helped graduates to get jobs within the New South Wales system, right? So that's one pathway. Obviously, in the more Canberra-focused agencies, the graduate recruitment program that a lot of these agencies and organisations and departments run on an annual basis is a key thing to keep your eye out for. It always gets tricky because those things happen very early in the year. So if you're doing the masters next year, then make sure to keep your eye out on those things in February, March next year, because they close early in the year and it's a fairly long process to get through. Other than that, I guess we try to help build your networks to allow you to be in a position to apply for jobs. So one just sort of final thing on that, there is a professional organisation for intelligence professionals within Australia, AIPIO. You can get a student membership to that. I'd encourage you to do it. I think it might cost you $30 or so a year. And it's a good way to meet people who are in the profession, a good way to network, and a good way to build some of those connections that can help perhaps help you find the pathway into this field.
Incredible. And one more for you. So what courses at the university could we look at if we're also interested in the collection side of intelligence?
Yeah, so I think obviously within our department, the Master of Cybersecurity has a little bit on, say, open source intelligence. So Jeff, I think, who's coming after me, will perhaps talk a little bit about some of the work he does on open source collection. Obviously, you're thinking more, the main place that I was in science and engineering, so IT, computer science. If you have a bit of a background in some of those coding and computer science, then maybe looking at some of those courses might be good. Other things to think about, other skills to sort of acquire alongside the general intelligence process might be foreign languages, right? If you know a foreign language, that's always going to stand you in good stead, or if you're learning a foreign language. But yeah, in terms of some of the collection disciplines where, because of the data revolution, that traditional focus on human intelligence, espionage, is comparatively becoming smaller compared to the focus on technical means of collection, right? Signals intelligence, open source intelligence, imagery intelligence. And so some of those computer science, cyber skills, I think, would be the way to think about focusing when it comes to the collection side of intelligence.
Incredible. I'm just going to keep you for a little bit longer here, Brian. And what intelligence analytical products are students exposed to?
Products in terms of the products that intelligence analysts produce and give to decision makers, for example. So some of the units will sort of think through the writing and preparation of an assessment report or a collection plan, for example. In my unit, you'll sort of see different primary sources about how intelligence communities have presented information to decision makers over time. So in that sort of sense of products, we will look at a few in terms of the tools that intelligence analysts use. Again, and Jeff might talk a little bit about some of the tools he uses in the cyber intelligence unit. Again, some of those SATs, those structured analytic techniques, some of the tools that get used in intelligence agencies around the Five Eyes today. So if you Google open source intelligence tools, you'll get a whole list of programs come up. They sort of different ones emerge, others drop away. So I think, as I sort of intimated before, what we're trying to do is to get across the fundamentals so that when you go into an agency or go into a workforce, that you can plug in particular tools that they might be using in that particular place.
Incredible. And we've got another one here from someone in the audience. So for someone planning on taking up a double degree in criminology and intelligence, how is the interplay between these subjects on the global scale? And thanks for a great session. So well done, Brian.
Yeah, and just before I sort of get into that particular question, the point about double degrees, I think, is a good one, right? So intelligence is a sort of professional set of skills that can be applied to many different contexts, right? As I said, most of us in the program are focused on that national security context, the strategic context, but we have other people in the program who are looking at law enforcement. Other people are looking at different parts of intelligence, business intelligence, or things like poaching, right? So a double degree with intelligence as one of those degrees can be good because you can get the set of skills that the Master of Intelligence provides with the policy context that this other degree provides, right? And so criminology, I guess, is one of those other contexts, right? The context of crime and law enforcement. And so I think it's a good combination, right? Intelligence and criminology. Now, as I said, most of our sort of work at the internship unit is at the New South Wales level, but I think when you're taking that to a global level, I think in our department we do we do think about that global perspective, right? So I know Alex looks at, Alex Simpson in the criminology stream looks at British questions of white collar crime. As I said, Sepa Guatiwa in our own intelligence stream looks at poaching as a crime in the African context. And Rolando looks at crime in the Mexican context. So, so I think we do have a global perspective if you did want to combine crim and intel.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Brian. And with that last question, it brings our session on our Master of Intelligence to an end. Thank you so much again, Brian, and it was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
So I'd now like to welcome you to our session on Master of Cybersecurity Analysis. And I'm pleased to introduce you to Course Director, Dr. Jeffrey Foster. Wonderful.
Thanks, Bridget. Can you hear me okay?
Over to you, Jeff. Can hear you perfectly. The stage is all yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Let me go ahead and share my slides real quick. Yeah, have a second here. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for coming. So I'm here to talk about the Master of Cybersecurity Analysis. My name is Dr. Jeff Foster. I'm an associate professor in cybersecurity studies, and I run the Master of Cybersecurity Analysis here at Macquarie. So this is a fantastic program, and we get a lot of questions about exactly what is the Master of Cybersecurity Analysis and how does it separate out from some of the other cybersecurity programs we have on offer at Macquarie. So hopefully I'll clear some of that up as we run through. Before I get into that, though, I do want to start by posing some questions to you. And I know this isn't a very interactive session, so you don't really get an opportunity to give me feedback and kind of give me your answers, but that's quite all right. So I'll pose these kind of 3 questions to you and have you think about them. And then I'll come back and we'll talk briefly about what the answers to them are, because they might surprise some of you. That first question is, who are the perpetrators of cybercrime? When you think of a cyber criminal, who do you think of? What does that person look like? What do they do? How old are they? Those types of kind of descriptions of who you think a perpetrator of cybercrime is. Second one is how much cybercrime breaches actually cost a company. So in a given instance, on average, how much does a cyber breach cost an independent company when they get hacked? And you'll be familiar with those ideas, but between the latest ones we've seen here in Australia with Optus and Medibank, but it happens across the board, across companies. And that question is, on average, how much does it cost a company? And finally, last question here is how long does it take to detect a cyber breach? So how long do you think it takes from the time criminal actors, bad actors get into a system for a cyber breach to the time that they get detected on average? And a lot of these are questions I ask students frequently, and a lot of people come to the board with kind of ideas in mind about what the answers to these questions are. So I'm going to break a few ideas down on you here of what it actually looks like in the real world. So when we talk about perpetrators of cybercrime, most people get this kind of image of some teenager wearing a hoodie in their mom's basement. And to some extent that used to be the case of cyber criminals many, many years ago. But the front of what that actually looks like today has changed dramatically. And we're no longer talking about independent bad actors, kids sitting in a basement somewhere, or 20 or 30-something-year-olds just trying to make a buck. The reality is most of the perpetrators of cyber crimes, the serious ones that we care about on a regular basis, the ones that get put into the news, don't tend to be those independent, somebody hacking away on a keyboard, just seeing what's out there. It usually tends to be large criminal organizations. So when you look at Medibank, for instance, the group behind that is a group called Revil. They're a Russian cyberware gang. They're a large organization, not necessarily state sanctioned, but at least state ignored by the Russian government. And there's a large number of those criminal organizations out there now, oftentimes acting in countries in which they don't necessarily get arrested for their crimes, or they act hand in hand with the government, like we see in North Korea and in China. So these are now really just large bad groups. And oftentimes they're tied to other criminal organizations, other mobs doing drugs, human trafficking, and a variety of other bad things. These aren't your regular kids anymore. That might change in the future with AI coming out, making it a lot easier for these cyber attacks to happen. But for now, at least, we're looking at very large bad criminal organizations. That second question, how much does a cyber breach cost? I think a lot of people get surprised by this number. In 2021, according to IBM, the average cost of a breach in any company, whether it gets caught or not, on average, the cost is about 4.3 million US dollars. It is a large sum of money. And that comes down to a breakdown of not just a ransomware attack and how much you have to pay for the ransom, but the payments to respond to the breach, figure out what happened, close it up, make sure that they're out of the systems, train your employees, make sure it doesn't happen again, integrate new systems. It all comes out to a very large amount of money. So when we see a number of organizations ramping up and starting to pay for a lot of cybersecurity experts on their payroll, you can start to see why it makes sense for them. At $4.3 million a breach, you can pay for a lot of staff to avoid the breach ever happening in the first place. And finally, the question of how long it takes to detect a cyber breach. I get a lot of wide-ranging responses in here. A lot of the time, the answers come down to a question of seconds, minutes, or hours of how long it takes to detect a breach. We have this kind of vision of our mind of a security operations center where there's a whole bunch of cyber analysts sitting around a table with big monitors in the front. And while there are some companies like banks that have those things, most of them don't. And the reality is the average time it takes to detect a cyber breach has even occurred is 9 months. 9 months on average. It is a long period of time. Our ability to detect cyber breaches is really delayed. This isn't the idea of a keyboard warrior in cybersecurity, fending off an attack like we see in the movies. It tends to be detecting it through log files or finding your data on the dark web somewhere for sale. So it can take a long time to detect. So that question of what cybersecurity kind of looks like, I'm hoping you start to paint a different picture in some of your minds as to what it tends to kind of look like. This isn't somebody sitting behind a computer fighting back the hackers like we see in movies. There's a whole lot of administration that goes around it and a whole lot of analysis in detecting what's occurred and in trying to avoid it in the future. So the next question I'll pose is what people in cybersecurity actually do. And this starts to get into the heart of what our program does in the Master of Cybersecurity Analysis, because there's actually a large stream of people in cybersecurity now. And 10, 15, 20 years ago, it used to be that someone did an IT cybersecurity degree, a company would come in and hire their cybersecurity person, and they'd kind of work independently of both IT and administration, and they do their own thing and get it all done. That was when cybersecurity was much simpler, though. The front on cybersecurity is a lot more complex and a lot more integrated now. So what a given person does in cybersecurity is a lot more varied as well. So there's a lot of different specialties that work in cybersecurity now, and it's not just the IT administrators. So there's a lot of ways of breaking it down, and I'll break it down into kind of a few of the main categories of what we can look at in terms of what people do in cybersecurity and what our program actually approaches here. That first case we see on our left, looking at IT administration and ethical hacking, that's what most people think of when they think of cybersecurity. And again, that used to be the big component of cybersecurity. These days, and it still exists to quite an extent, but these days, most of that work is done by IT administration. People with a Bachelor of IT or a Master's of IT administration. It's expected that people in those roles now integrate security in what they do and keep security in mind in what they do. So there's no longer that many jobs. There's still quite a few, but not that many jobs coming out that are new ones focusing on those keyboard warrior cybersecurity specialists. And that's because that's kind of split into even more management and policy side, and then IT administration takes care of the integration of the technology. So that brings us to our next ideas here of our other areas in cybersecurity, and these ones on the right are more where our program focuses. First is in intelligence and threat administration, policing investigations, and forensics. This is a lot more of those. Who are those bad actors? What do we know about them? What tools, tactics, techniques, and procedures are they currently using in order to get into systems that I need to feed IT administration to tell them, here's a weapon, here's a cyber weapon that's currently being used in our industry that we know is occurring. Please start defending against this. And then IT administration integrates it on their side. That's that intelligence and threat intelligence kind of side of it. Policing and investigations should be pretty straightforward. That's your AFP, New South Wales State Police or other police who actually do investigations and policing within the digital front. And forensics that plays a heavy hand in both policing and in organizations as well. And that's digital forensics, obviously. And finally, on our right, we're looking at people in cybersecurity who do policy making, who actually write up the policies and the standards and change organizations and their policies or governments to fit the current threats and intelligence. There's risk management, taking a look across IT information systems and saying, okay, where are our vulnerabilities? Where are our weak points? If we do get hit with an attack, what are they going to get? How do we respond to that? And we can see failures, for instance, in both Optus and Medibank in terms of what that response kind of was and a failure of risk management in that front. There's also a big amount of change management. When it comes to cybersecurity, it integrates a lot of change. When you change IT systems, you also change what needs to occur for employees within an organization, what they need to look out for, how they need to manage their security. And so working in change management is an important component of it. And finally, usable security and security behavior training. Those are taking a look at your security policies, what it is you're doing for security in your security systems, and making sure you integrate that with the people who have to implement them. So usable security is about making security systems that are usable, that people can actually operate and do so in a good, safe way. So our program kind of focuses on these right two boxes in terms of what it is we work on and teach within this program. Now, across the board, all of these also work in what's called incident response and in consulting. So an incident response, that's what occurs after a breach has happened. So after a company has been hit with an attack, they said, okay, we've now been breached, we've lost these data, people are in our system still, what do we do? And that kind of brings everybody in cybersecurity to the forefront, and everybody in every one of these disciplines working together to respond to a given incident. First, looking at that IT administration of making sure that they stop the bleeding as it's referred, to make sure that data aren't coming out, money isn't coming out of the company, and that they've gotten the hackers back out of the systems, and integrating solutions to stop them in the future. And then the rest of these going through looking at who these attackers were, what they were after, how are we going to respond to these, how are we going to change policy and organizational structure to make sure it doesn't happen again. It's kind of a very long list of what occurs in terms of incident response. And finally, consulting. Unsurprisingly, a lot of companies either can't afford or don't have enough cybersecurity professionals across the board on all these different areas. A lot of them still, especially medium-sized businesses, will still have one or two kind of cyber specialists who work more in the IT administration side, and then they hire consulting firms for the rest of these. And so that's a much wider gamut, I hope, of understanding of what cybersecurity professionals actually do these days, above and beyond just sitting at a computer, updating firewalls or implementing firewalls and updating software packages. Very important, it still exists, but that tends to get taken care of by IT administration now. Giving a bit of a wider range, there's a lot of information on the screen. We'll start in the left and kind of talk about what kind of careers we see our students go into out of this program. I've kind of focused heavily on government careers on this slide, although they go across the board in organizations as well. So career outcomes of our students, they wind up in defense as cyber policy analysts, or the Office of National Assessment, or the Prime Minister and Cabinet's office. They work as cybersecurity analysts in the AFP, in defense, in the New South Wales State Police. We have cyber threat analysts. They go to banks, telecommunications companies, both state and federal government, Australian Signals Directorate, Australian Signals Intelligence. And finally, cybersecurity experts across the board. A lot of companies that hire these are multinationals and banks. Macquarie Group is a big hire of our former students. All the big four banks, all the big four consulting firms hire our students, and a lot of those consulting firms as well that aren't listed here in security firms. And what's important about the ones that I've listed here, those are those kind of big companies where a lot of students come in who don't have a lot of experience yet. They provide a lot of on-job training as well. So when you go to another company, say a medium-sized firm that might have just a handful of cybersecurity specialists, they tend to hire people out of these other companies because they've gotten that education from somewhere, and then they've gotten on-the-job training for several years at one of these big organizations as well. So a wide gamut of where our students wind up going. I got to move this 1 second. Sorry about that. Other boxes in my way here. So that's where our students tend to go. I'll talk a little bit too about what our program is. We'll take a look on the right here of this graph under our Master of Cybersecurity Analysis column. And these are kind of our main units within our program. We've got a lot of other elective units you take out of the other programs, other degree programs in our department, along with other electives you can take anywhere else. But our kind of 6 main units here are critical thought and research design, obviously an important program, important class, no matter what degree you're taking. In cybersecurity, especially critical thought and being able to design research programs to understand how people are using your security systems are all extremely important. And we teach that in critical thought and research design. We've got cybercrime and cyber policing. That class focuses heavily on the types of cybercrime that exists, taking a look at usual practices, doing lots of demos of cyber attacking skills that criminals actually use in the real world, and then talking about those. What are our common threats? What are the common attack types? And what are the common defenses against those attacks? In Australian cyber intelligence, we talk heavily about intelligence and cybersecurity, taking a look at the threat actors that are out there, who they are, what their motives are, how they operate. We focus heavily on that tactics and techniques kind of level. So looking at general broad pictures of the types of tactics that they use and how those can be defended against. While going through and taking a look, usually in depth, at a specific advanced persistent threat, an APT group. And really, so for example, last year we did one of the Russian hacking groups that's involved in the Ukrainian war, with a big intelligence report at the end discussing them, how they operate, what they do, what their cyber weapons are, those types of details. In applied cybersecurity, that is our heavy technical class. You don't have to have any technical skills coming into it. It focuses on teaching you for the CISP, which is a cyber accreditation that you can get. And the idea is that after that class, you should be ready to study a little bit more and go actually take your CISP exam if you want to become accredited in cybersecurity. We teach cyber conflict, cyber espionage, and information warfare. Unsurprising, that's our big cyber warfare class. It talks heavily about social media, about information and disinformation campaigns, and how those are affecting governments and organizations as well. And finally, our simulation and cybersecurity class, which again runs gamut with simulations across the other degree programs that we have on offer, where you work across a problem, a fictitious problem that's occurring. You bring your cybersecurity skills with you to it to actually help solve those problems in a group with other people from the department. So that's kind of our main core structure on here. And again, you take electives on top of those, and those electives are up to you. But that's kind of the main focus of what it is we go through. As you run through, our main learning outcomes we look for is for your ability to analyze real-world cyber threats, take a look at what's actually out there, what's occurring now in the world, and who those actors are, what their threats are, how it is we can defend against them, and how we can change policy to help prevent them in the future. Develop solutions for cyber threats, so again, how to defend against them, setting policy. In some of our classes, very technical skills you'll learn as well that are actually more hands-on for how to actually defend against those cyber threats. Developing intelligence-driven policies. So it's not about setting up policies that don't make sense or don't make sense within a given industry. So it's how you develop that intelligence for the industry that you're working in, and then how you change policies in order to avoid those cyber threats and avoid the types of incidents that we see regularly occurring at the moment. Your ability to create an implementable cyber policy, of course, drives off of that, and make ethical and socially informed judgments, which is becoming increasingly important as we see the attack front in the defense against cybersecurity starts to move in, especially with the Australian Signals Directorate, starting to move into a more offensive kind of stance. And taking that more offensive kind of stance, how do you make those judgments ethically and socially informed when you are looking at offensive cybersecurity and going after threat actors who might be state sanctioned by the Russian government or the Chinese government or North Korean government? And finally, how to communicate with specialists and non-specialist audiences. In these other fields outside of the IT administration side, your roles would be heavily involved in talking to boards, talking to governments and other stakeholders who don't have a lot of cybersecurity knowledge or skills. So that ability to communicate with them across the board becomes extremely important. And just I briefly touched on this, but forgot to go into it, is when you come into this program, we don't make a lot of assumptions about your already technical skills. We do train those up as you go. while it's great if you come in with some technical skills, it'll make things a lot easier for you. We do all the training for technical skills that you need for this as you run along. So again, through that CISPS course and through other courses, we actually show you how these occur and walk you through some of these attacks. All right, and finally give you kind of when we look at our 4 more technical cybersecurity classes, looking at applied cybersecurity, cybercrime, cyber policing, Australian cyber intelligence, and cyber conflict, espionage, and information warfare. Those programs, you can kind of get an idea here for what it is we touch on within those. So we look at domestic and international cybercrime, cyber warfare, cyber intelligence across those last 3 programs, cyber defense, and developing your technical skills. These are kind of our core areas in which we focus in your education in this program. I think I'm running a bit late on that, so I might wrap that up quickly, being brief on that slide. Oh. So I got one more, and lots of extracurricular options as you run through this program. We do have the new upcoming cybercrime lab that we're running. We'll talk about that. If you come in, feel free to shoot me an email if you have an interest in it. Always happy to chat about it. We do have cybersecurity student groups, intelligence student groups, and opportunities to do supervised research with an academic and internships and placements with intelligence companies, big consulting firms, banks, and a variety of other places if you could choose to go that path. All right. Stop the share on there. Sorry about that. Ran that a little bit late.
Totally fine. So we've still got a little bit of time, so we'll probably squeeze in 2 questions for you. First of all, thank you for all that expert knowledge and information on cybersecurity here in Australia. So first question for you is hopefully an easy one, is simply, what is your background?
Well, my background is actually a PhD in psychology. So I'm coming from, so I do a lot of research on the behavioral aspects of cybersecurity. I take a look at what makes people behave in good and bad secure ways, and how we can improve those kind of better cybersecurity practices. So, so while it sounds like a strange background, it is actually heavily tied to it. But I will jump back and say that prior to going into academia, I worked in IT administration for years as well. So I do have a bit of an IT background, which brought me into that field.
Incredible. And last question, which I'm sure is a very common one that you get. What is the difference between the Master of Cybersecurity Analysis and the Master of IT in Cybersecurity?
Sure. Hopefully I covered some of that in the slides as I went through there. But the Master in IT Security is very heavily an IT administration kind of degree program, which is fantastic. It's looking at people who want to go and work in an IT department as a cybersecurity specialist. And there's lots of roles for those, and they're a great career option. Our focus is more on the people who work in training, in policy management, and in threat detection, threat analysis, and intelligence.
Incredible. Thank you so much for all your incredible expertise. So unfortunately, we've come to the end of this session. So thank you, Jeff. It's been great hearing the exciting things in store for our students in the Master of Cybersecurity Analysis. And it's a pleasure having you.
Thanks, Bridget.
No worries. And for our audience, if this session has sparked more questions about the course, contact our postgraduate team on 02 9850 6791 or email postgraduate@mq.edu.au to get them answered. So I can just see a Q&A popped up in the Q&A, so you can contact us using those methods. But welcome to our final session for the evening, the Masters of Criminology, and to provide his expertise in this space, I'm pleased to introduce Vincent Hurley. Welcome.
Oh, Bridget, how are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
I'm excellent. Right. I think hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, so where are we? There we are. So evening, everybody, and thanks very much for those of you who hung in there since we started this, and for those of you who have just joined us, the plan will soon be over. If you've got any questions, please just message Bridget. More than happy to answer anything. If I can't answer them, I'll let you know and hand it over to Bridget. So I've been teaching criminology and a Masters of Criminology for the past 14 years here at Macquarie, and absolutely love it. Just love it. Can't get enough of crime myself. But before I actually came to become a university lecturer by accident, I spent 29 years as a police officer in New South Wales. So straight away, when I arrange or architect my course, I want to make sure that it addresses the practical realities of criminology on the street every day within society. That's, to me, the most irrelevant and the most important thing. That yes, there's theory, but there also has to be the practical application so people can understand it. So I spent, as I said, 29 years in the police. I worked street policing or general duties at Blacktown, Mount Druitt, St Mary's and Penrith. For those of you who don't know, that's in Sydney's outer western suburbs, which is a medium to low socioeconomic area. I was a detective at Mount Druitt and Penrith, investigating local serious crime. So we're talking about domestic homicides, we're talking about break and enters, we're talking about local drug dealers, we're talking about local fraud, although now it's probably cyber. It's not my area of expertise, it's Jeff's. So local serious crime. I then went to an organised crime unit that solely looked at child abuse. So child sexual assault, child violence, generally children under the age of 10. So I spent a number of years investigating what would now be called the sex crimes unit, but I looked at children. I then went to an organised crime unit where we looked at purely at kidnappings, homicide, home invasions and violent armed robberies. Now, you don't get many violent armed robberies anymore in Australia, at least, because everyone taps and go and the ATMs. So armed robberies, for example, throughout Australia now are nearly non-existent, but certainly home invasions are still very relevant. I was a hostage negotiator for quite a few years and negotiating with people who were going to jump off a cliff or jump off the harbour, Sydney Harbour Bridge, literally. So you'd intervene there, suicide intervention, to try and give them a glimmer of hope about life. Also sieges, so a hostage taker would take a victim. Sometimes it would be family court related. So you might have a spouse or a step parent taking a child hostage because a family law court ruling didn't go in their way. Or a really common one, unfortunately, was children having mental health episodes or crisis and holding their brother or sister or their mum or dad hostage while they went through this psychotic episode. So I did that for quite a few years. I then decided to work a bit of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and I went and worked for the New South Wales Department in Premier and Cabinet, which was, I was on loan or on secondment. So I was still a police officer, but I went there looking at how to reduce domestic violence within New South Wales. And I was there for 3 years. And we spoke with politicians and we spoke with other NGOs such as Department of Family and Community Service and women's organisations. And we tried and formulated policy to reduce domestic violence in New South Wales. In amongst all of that, this is not necessarily in order, I was an undercover operative and I'm always reluctant to say this, I was involved in the investigation of the importation and trafficking up the east coast of Australia with primarily cocaine, which is, if anyone watched the Australian ABC last night, the cocaine trafficking, fascinating. And I then looked at the manufacturing of amphetamine, speed or LSD. So I did that for a number of years. And still to this day, my children do not believe me. So when I talk about criminology, I get really excited. And as the person who organises criminology, the undergraduates and postgraduate students, my main aim is to make sure that it's relevant. It is relevant to the jobs that those people are doing or they want to do. Okay, so yes, there's theory, and I'll go into some of that in a minute. But for me, for your employability, having been in the police for 30 years, it's more than just theory. It has to be something that you can take away and say, I learned X, Y, and Z, and I can apply this theory to the practicalities of cocaine importation in Australia, if that was what your job interview was, for example. So I've been here for 14 years. I did my PhD in policing, unsurprisingly, but my PhD in policing wasn't around crime. It was around about organisational management of how police coped with massive job cuts in the Northern Hemisphere. And the result of that was catastrophic. Okay. Normally I would say at this point in time, has anyone got any questions? So what is criminology? I say criminology is just a really general term for a whole host, which I'll go into a minute, of explanations about crime. So if you had 3 beakers and one of them was full of just water, and in that first beaker, you poured the chemical called society and population. So when I mean society and population, you know, it encompasses the globe. So everyone, whether they're rich or whether they're poor, whether they're educated, they're uneducated, whatever their moral compass might be, whatever their biases are, whatever their prejudices are, what they are tolerant to, what they're not tolerant to, their attitudes on drugs, their attitude on cyber hacking, their attitudes on white-collar crime. This notion of population in society, easy way to explain it, is just a chemical, and we pour it into the jar. The other chemical then you pour in is crime. Crime, thousands upon thousands of crime, white-collar crime, cyber crime, hacking, armed hold-ups, homicides, corporate crime, money laundering. The list goes on, and you pour that in. And then the third liquid you pour in is criminal justice system, police, courts, and corrections. So the police, what do the police do? What do the courts do? What do the corrections do? In other words, how relevant are they? What's the reaction of the criminal justice system to crime and society? If you poured them all in together, you would get a chemical reaction, as it's got here, and that chemical reaction is criminology. Now, criminology is just a general word. It's just like saying, I like takeaway, and I do. I like takeaway. That could be Japanese, it could be Chinese, it could be Lebanese, it could be Thai, it could be anything. So criminology is just a general word, just like the word takeaway. And there are hundreds of areas you can study within criminology. You've got, well, I'll show you some in a minute. You've got theoretical criminology, which is like just a study of theory about crime. You've got applied criminology, how you apply it actually in the workplace, for example, or throughout society. So we'll have a couple of look at these as we go. So the Masters of Criminology. The Masters of Criminology, as Jeff said earlier, is the same as all the other courses, 1.5 years. And depending on your job, you can get RPL for it or you can get credits to do it. It depends on where you've come from and your job. So criminology, or the theory of criminology, it's a social phenomenon. Crime is a social phenomenon. Years ago, knife crime was a social phenomenon. Now it's not so much, not in Australia at least. Cocaine is a social phenomenon now. Why? Why is Australia considered to be the greatest consumer of cocaine per head of population in the rest of the world? I could talk about that for 2 hours, but I won't. So it's a phenomenon. That phenomena will come and go. The very beginning of cybercrime, as Jeff said, was, and cybercrime's not my area of expertise, is that people sitting at home hacking. That phenomena has gone, where now it's done by organised crime. So, what is the social phenomena of crime? Crime trends come and go. COVID-19 was a social phenomenon. Why did the police have the responsibility to enforce, in Australia at least, COVID-19 regulations? It's a health issue. It wasn't a police issue, it was a public health issue. But the phenomena is that the police are the only organisation that have this really broad criminological power or authority to enforce laws that the government's handed down. So look at social phenomena. Criminology looks at the making of the laws and the breaking of the laws, and that's my 4 children, right? They break laws all the time, and the reaction to the laws. So how is law made? Well, within the Masters of Criminology, we look at policy making, which I'll go into in a moment. Where does policing policy or crime policy come from? It comes from the general media. The media hop on an issue, put pressure on politicians. Politicians go, gee, we need to do something about this. And then it evolves into policy. That's just not in isolation. You've got interest groups. You've got organisations that influence policy. The breaking of the laws. Now, everyone has a social contract theory of society that we are happy to give up some of our freedoms to be able to live in a harmonious society. For example, in Australia, an Australian long weekend, around Australia Day in January, there's no alcohol consumed mostly along the east coast of Australia on the beaches or to reduce alcohol-related crime. So we give up a degree of our freedom. Otherwise, if we didn't, then people would be out, running rampant, doing whatever they wanted. And how do people react to the law or the breaking of the laws? Rational thought theory. Why do people do it? People react to breaking the laws for a number of different reasons. First of all, they react out of excitement. That is also a motivation to crime. They are excited that their crime has been recognised. That's what they wanted. They're happy about that. Or they might spiral into depression. So what motivates people to cause crime? Then we look at the body of principles or the process. So once it gets to the courts or to the police or inside the prison, as Miriam talked about, there are programs, CT programs in prisons that try to de-radicalise or address some of these issues. The police, the Young Offenders Act, which is mostly throughout Australia, try to divert young offenders away from the criminal justice system. The courts have alternative sentencing. They have the drug courts, and the drug courts try to address that individual's drug habit if that's driving their crime. So what is applied? I'll go back a screen. So that's the theory. We'll talk a bit about theory. Then we talk about its practical application. So we're starting up here and we're coming down to a street level practical application. Evidence-based policy. So where does the policy come from? Where is the evidence? Well, the evidence, very quickly, is through Euro crime statistics and research, Australian stats, information from specific organisations such as, Trafficking Australia, if you're talking about human trafficking. It can come from newspapers, for informants, for newspapers or their sources. So we look at the hard evidence that may or may not be able to address a crime phenomenon. One of the things that we look at, and I'll go into the mixture of or classes that people come to, we look at law enforcement in Australia is one subject or one unit. And I've picked this intentionally because it goes to address the vast bulk of the students who do the Masters in Criminology come from overseas. So I wrote down before I came here tonight, my students, and I had 50 of them last semester, and some zoomed in from overseas and some were students here studying. And they were from Finland, Indonesia, Thailand, Sweden, Fiji, Africa, Lebanon, Pakistan, and then we had domestic students. The students from Indonesia, Thailand, Fiji, Africa, and India were within already existing law enforcement agencies. They existed within their military or their relevant policing organisations. So the people that come to Australia and do this Masters in Criminology generally are already within that field of work. So why did they do it? They do it to gain promotion. They do it because they're deciding or planning their future, that they want to, or their time is coming to an end in the military, and they want to go into a similar field in another government or non-government job. So when they come out here and they do law enforcement in Australia, just as one particular unit, what happens is that I know a question earlier was, do you get in visiting lecturers to come in to talk about it? We, or I, don't necessarily do that, because a lot of our students are already international students who have got a degree and have that criminology experience, practical. So then we look at the Australian context and compare it to the international context. What's it like, to address crime in Sweden or Finland is dramatically different because of the social welfare programs in Australia, in contrast to India. So we look at, and we give them their experiences. I ask them, what do you do in Africa or Fiji in relation to your drug problem, or especially in Africa, their problems of crime and blood diamonds and things like that. So we take practical examples and we discuss it. We look at policing of major events. So policing of major events around the world, the most one that comes to mind is, of course, the Olympics or the FA Cup final. But how did it evolve that there was so much security around these events? Well, it goes back to the 1972 Munich Olympics, where there was very little security in the murder of the Israeli athletes by the Black September or Black September terrorist organisation. So we look at the evolution of that. We look at the evolution of the policing in the liquor industry. Australia, particularly New South Wales, but Australia has a terrible track record of addressing alcohol-related crime, although that has come as a social phenomena that has been addressed, was addressed with the lockout laws. But in some countries where alcohol is banned, they have no context to place that in. So we look at that. Border protection. Where do our border protection laws come from? Where did they evolve from? Well, in Australia at least, they evolved from the Tampa affair under John Howard, where he made that famous quote, something along the lines of, "We will determine who comes to our country." And that border protection policy has been exported to the UK as we speak right now. So we look at the criminological explanations and how the external borders are used to prevent people coming in. What are the ramifications of that to all the people who want to come here, whether it be refugees, economic refugees, or refugees from a war zone? And we look at general policing strategies, such as zero tolerance policing, which is very common in America. We would never, in Australia, accept zero tolerance policing in the same way they do in America. Australian society would not accept it. Most countries don't accept it. So what is it that makes policing in America and its crime unique to that zero tolerance policing? The closest we've ever come to zero tolerance policing in Australia was during COVID-19. Yet there was no zero tolerance policing in some Nordic countries. Why is that? So we look at the criminological aspects and trying to explain it to each other in class or on Zoom if they can join us overseas, how this can be. So when we look at the masters in criminology, the assessments vary. Okay, so there is participation online. So it's not always about sitting in class, listening to Vince Hurley talk about whatever the case may be. So there's participation. So you might turn up and you might make a blog for 100 words or something on, the current issue of the day. So we make them relevant to the current issue of the day. There'll be an assignment. That's a part of the university requirement. There'll be a policy brief. And this is not all in one course. This is spread across the master's course. So there'll be a policy brief, and the policy will be about organised crime, generally speaking, or drugs, for example, or will be around, say, the deployment of UN peacekeepers handing over to police in a weak nation state. You look at current issues, for example, the phenomena of the dope divers, DOP, the dope divers who strap cocaine to the hull of ships. Now, how will legislation and public attitudes address that? And there's quizzes. So there's a variety of different assessment formats that I encourage and the lecturers use. One of the questions earlier on tonight was, do you have contract markers or contract lecturers? No. The lectures in our course are done by our full-time lecturers, myself, and Rolando, who was a crime prevention officer back in Mexico City as a police officer. So we all have practical experience in policing. Bridget, I think that might be it. Oh, sorry, what type of jobs? Most important. Some of my peers have already covered this. I want to make the point that for many people that come and do the Master's of Criminology, they are already within that field. They already work for Department of Defence, Commonwealth security agencies, which have been mentioned numerous times throughout the night, any state and territory police, overseas policing agencies, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Australian Border Force. So they use their Masters in Criminology, as I said before, because their contract is coming to an end and they want to go into a similar field, or they want to get promoted, or they're in a government job at the moment and they want to change from whatever they're doing into a different area within the same organisation. So that's generally why people do our course. And it's probably more, I was going to say more clear-cut than, say, some of the other courses, but most of them are already within that field. That's it, Bridget, I think. Yep.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Vince. That was truly a great introduction to the Master of Criminology.
Bridget,
right.
did the lights go out on your end?
Look, we saw your lights go out, but they didn't go out on my end.
I should have done a runner.
That is no worries. Alrighty, we've got a wonderful question from Harsha, one of our guests here. So you did sort of already go over this, but I think we're just asking for some elaboration. So could you elaborate about the job opportunities for international students, especially in the law enforcement areas after completing the coursework? And they love your enthusiasm and they look forward to meeting you in person. So a beautiful compliment from Harsha.
Thank you. Sorry, what was the name of the person?
Harsha.
Harsha.
And I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah, well, yeah. Harsha, thanks very much for hanging in there and listening. So a job as an international individual, generally speaking, you have to be an Australian citizen to get a job within any of the agencies that I've mentioned. Now, it was Brian spoke about internships. You can get I know this is not directly answering your question, you can get internships within the Masters of Criminology into some state-based law enforcement agencies, such as the police. But it's really up to the government department that the government department makes that determination based on your visa and whether you're an Australian citizen or not. I know that for Commonwealth government jobs, like any of the intelligence services, Department of Defence, you wouldn't be able to get a job in there if you were an Australian citizen. Certainly a job within, I just made some notes earlier, jobs within non-government agencies such as KPMG, Ernst & Young, the banks, the transport, whether it be planes or trains in their security sector, you can get a job, that's fine. But in relation to the private sector, it's up to that specific organisation that makes that determination. I'm just having a look to see if I've missed anything in relation to that. Asha, did I answer your question?
I hope you did. Well, I think we'll take it as a yes. And what I'll do is, just because we're slightly running out of time, Harsha, if you do want any more guidance or anything with your question, you can always reach out to the postgraduate team, who you'll get their details about them very, very soon. But I will ask you one last question, which I'm sure is a common one that you get. How does the Master of Criminology intersect and overlap with the Master of Counterterrorism?
Okay. I thought the question was going to be, because I get there all the time, are you able to read minds, criminal minds? No.
Good question.
In criminology, you cannot read criminal minds, because if I did that, then I wouldn't have the problems with my 4 teenage children. So, terrorism is not my area of expertise, so that's the first thing I'll say. So when you do your Masters in Criminology, there is the opportunity to be able to do terrorism subjects. Now, also a part of the criminology, you can do a unit called supervision, for me it's called supervision of a research project. So some of the projects that students have done in the last 2 years, which I wrote down before I came here tonight, was, as I try and find my notes, where are they? So Masters of Criminology students have done research into human trafficking within the construction industry. They've looked at the relationship, I'm going to do it right now, looking at the relationship between the illegal tobacco trade in the Asia Pacific region and how it finances terrorist organisations. So for an example like that, my area of expertise is not terrorism, it is organised crime. So I would take that with that student, discuss the project, and then go to someone like Miriam, who has an area in expertise in relation to Hezbollah, and say, are we on the right track? So I'm not saying for 1 minute I'm the font of all knowledge, but there is the opportunity to just do a 10,000 word research report on a terrorism subject, for example. Just to finish off, because I'm mindful of the time, I always think it's a good idea, and this is just my opinion, that when you do a master's of whatever, if there's the opportunity for you to look at something outside of that immediate area or that stream, if you have options to do that, do so. Because you don't know when you finish your master's in, say, a year and a half's time, what other jobs may come up, or jobs that you're not aware of at the time. So if you just did, for example, pure criminology, and there's always crime, so you'll be right. But if you did pure criminology, you can get a job, if you already don't have one, within that area. But if you did criminology and then decided to do something on cybercrime, that would give you an extra leverage to go into another area that perhaps when you're doing it, you weren't really aware of. So, and I give this advice, I gave this advice yesterday to, 150 HSC students. And I say the same things to under and postgraduates. Keep your options open and do what you want that you're passionate about. But don't forget, in the back of your mind, in 18 months' time, you may not necessarily know what else is out there. So I hope that answers that question.
That's a very good note to leave it on. And that is unfortunately our last question. And thank you so much for being with us here tonight, Vince. It's been a pleasure having you. But that brings a close to our postgraduate showcase for security, intelligence, and criminology. Thank you to all our course directors tonight for all of their insights and expertise. And especially thank you to Vince for sticking right to the end.
It's a pleasure. Good luck to you all.
And for our attendees, coming up soon are our postgraduate consultations between the 5th and the 16th of June. So if we didn't get to your questions, or if this session has left you wanting to find out more about our postgraduate courses, you can book a one-on-one consultation with our team through the link in your email, or scan the QR code that's on your screen now to book your preferred time slot. The postgraduate team are also available for all your coursework inquiries, and you can contact them on 02 9850 6791 or email postgraduate@mq.edu.au. We very much look forward to supporting your career aspirations here at Macquarie University and providing you with a pathway to an exhilarating career. Take care and good night.